Hello, and welcome to a conversation with myself, Mark Vernon, and my friend and oft collaborator, but we'll say about more of that in a minute, Robert Rowland Smith. Hi there, Robert.
Hello, Mark, oft collaborator. Nice to see you.
Hey, look, thanks so much for joining me because we speak on the day, 1st of September, when my book, Awake, William Blake and the Power of the Imagination, is released in the US and other parts of North America, I believe. And it's been out in the UK for about 3 months. I've been talking about it a lot online. I'm doing podcasts when I can, writing articles. But it's particularly a joy to talk to you because you have a deep background in literature, a keen interest in matters inner, be they spiritual or otherwise. And so I'm kind of interested to know quite where the conversation might go as we turn to this great figure of English letters and indeed imagery, William Blake.
Yeah, well, indeed. And I'm delighted to be doing this with you, Mark. And you've got copies of your book behind you. But for those of you people who are not just using audio, but video as well, there's Mark's book. Beautiful, beautiful colours, actually. So I'm going to go into kind of interview mode, if that's okay, Mark, rather than partner or collaborator mode today. And William Blake is probably more famous than he is understood, I would imagine. And I think we have at least two versions of William Blake that kind of circulate in the popular consciousness. And I think what you're doing in your book is adding a third, or maybe correcting the first two. So we have, I think, let's call it a primary school version of William Blake, which is Songs of Innocence and Experience, pleasant ditties with nice engravings sort of curled around them, accessible, pretty verses, maybe with some deep meanings, and you might look in those a bit, say in secondary school. You might look at some of the poems like London, for example, which are a bit darker, and think about Satanic Mills. But generally speaking, this is quite a containable poet on the one hand. On the other hand, for those who get a bit further, there is the weird stuff at the end of Blake's life, where he writes epic poetry in what seems like a very esoteric fashion, a mixture of Byzantine, Egyptian, Greek, goodness knows what else, imagery, which seems to be only for the initiates. And it seems to me those two sort of versions of Blake are current. But I think what you're trying to do in your book, Mark, is to sort of go beyond both of those, really, and to draw a line, actually, between the earlier work and the later work, as far as I can see, to connect them. And also to say to us, actually, even some of that early work is quite profound, Songs of Innocence and Experience. And actually, the later work isn't just allegory and fantasy. He's saying some things quite directly there about spiritual experience and what it is. So maybe that's a way into this, Mark. You can pick that apart, obviously, and come back on any of it.
No, it makes sense to me, both in the sense of your analysis of how people tend to receive Blake and how I'm trying to push through to I don't know if you call it deeper or maybe more holistic Blake, not grabbing a little bit, that you can make sense of, that adds a bit of colour to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower. Who's not going to like that? Or, as you're saying, some of the earlier poems can be read at a more accessible level. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. But then what do you make of what is the bulk of Blake's work? Imagery and then the long epic poems and the mythological poems of his middle period. If not just sort of politely putting them to one side, or doing what also is done is kind of trying to diagnose Blake. This is the more critical approach to Blake, but sort of saying, there's a lot of craziness going on there, and then there's moments of illumination, and so the more serious critic tries to pick up on that. Or I think also what happens actually is that people use Blake as a kind of springboard to then go into their own creativity. And that's perfectly valid to do. But the reception history, you might say, of Blake is therefore actually the normal way that people write about Blake these days, I think. They do start with Blake, kind of gets them going, but then they talk about how he affected the Beats or American Transcendentalism or the psychedelic Renaissance or cartoons in the imagery. They kind of look at what happened next. And what I really want to try and do is, say, look, Blake, I think, was a powerful critical figure in the sense that he understood what was going on in his times that have become our times. And what he's trying to do is enable us to perceive more clearly both what's going on inside ourselves, but also the inside of the whole world, the kind of spirit of his times. But it is radical. And if I'm going to cut to the chase, I think what Blake is opening up for us is how we can ourselves as human beings converse more fully and richly with the intelligences that surround us. So this is the intelligences in the natural world, be it the plants and animals, be it the cosmos, be it what the rising sun might mean, what the setting sun might mean to us. Why, for example, when you want to, propose to your partner, would you love to do it with the sun setting behind you? And Blake wants to say, look, don't just treat that as a romantic gesture, lovely though it is, but ask yourself, why might the setting sun resonate with your consciousness in that powerful, important moment? Maybe it's because it too is a powerful, important expression of something about the expansion of light, about the hopes for what we have over the horizons of our lives. Maybe there's a deep sympathy between these moments in our lives and these moments in the world around us that isn't just a kind of romantic gesture, but is, as another big influence on me, Owen Barfield said, is Romanticism come of age. This is saying something to us about the ontology of the whole world of which we're a part. And that's why we love these moments, because it is us speaking to the cosmos and the cosmos speaking back to us. The spiritual intelligences aren't just something which we privately harbour, but it are in the wider world. So Blake, I think, was onto what is often called the disenchantment of the modern period, but isn't just saying, look, through my private imagination, your private imagination, if we're lucky, we can sort of throw some colour back onto an otherwise colourless cosmos. He's saying, no, something much, much more ambitious and challenging and liable to lead him to be accused of being crazy, which he was then and still is now, which is saying, no, the reason why we think and feel and yearn and hope and despair and have the full richness of our inner life is not because we're some sort of exception in the cosmos, but because we're born of a cosmos that is in some way or other fully engaged in this rich interiority too. And so his poetry and imagery, both early actually, as you're saying, the songs of Innocence and Experience are actually much more involved than can seem, and that's why they're poems that you keep rereading, because that opens up to you. But particularly in the later poetry as well, using mythology, I think, to enable you to enter into what you might call a virtual world in the poems that gradually stirs the capacity to commune more fully with the world that we actually live in as well. So he's got nothing less than the revival, with the differences that the modern world brings, particularly a freedom, I think, that's very important, but a revival of how our ancestors would have experienced the world before. They would have performed their libations, engaged in their rituals, paid attention to the seasons, not just because it gave a bit of shape to their life, but because they felt themselves to be living with these intelligences. And that was all about a kind of relationship that sustains the richness of that. So that's the sort of cut to the fullness, I think, of what Blake might be about, and the experience which it's still growing, it's still developing, but which I really tried to hold to in the writing of the book was, say, look, if this is what Blake is offering, can we take that seriously? How can we follow it? And what does it mean to us now, both individually and collectively?
Mark, what a wonderful set of thoughts and descriptions there. I want to pick up a word you used just in passing there, but actually a word that features really on the cover of the book and is in your title, William Blake and the Power of the Imagination. I just want to pick up on the notion of the imagination. And I'll make this question a bit more exaggerated for dramatic effect. But I would say these days, imagination as an idea has got a little bit debased. Use your imagination. You can be creative and use your imagination. And that seems to me a process of, it's a creative process. It can be an artistic process. But it doesn't, I think, in the modern world, have quite the resonance it would have had for William Blake and indeed his contemporaries. I mean, you mentioned my own interest in literature, and I remember studying the Romantics, of which William Blake was considered one, and of course Coleridge and Wordsworth, and later Keats and Shelley, though he's more of the earlier generation, really. And particularly particularly Coleridge, imagination is a big deal as a concept, as you know. And if in the modern world it's become a little bit secular, a sort of expansion of the inner world on one's own terms, I think in the late 18th century, and this applies to both Blake and Coleridge and the German Romantics as well, imagination is also, I think, without over-egging it too much, a spiritual and possibly a religious faculty too. And I think you're hinting at that a bit in what you just say there, but perhaps you could just help people think into how Blake himself might have understood the notion of imagination and the degree to which his works, broadly conceived, and I include the visual works, were to him works of imagination, maybe even with a capital I.
Yeah, it's absolutely goes to the heart of what I was trying to say before. So thanks for picking up on that. And I think you're absolutely right. There's a kind of thinned out, privatized notion of the imagination that is worked with most commonly now. And we imagine that when we go to an art gallery, for example, if we're lucky, we might encounter some works made by an artist who's probably got a lot more imagination than I have. And so we hope to get some sort of titration of that imagination, and maybe it'll illuminate us a little bit more. But I think Blake's talking about something else entirely. I mean, he for example will say Jesus the imagination. He will say nature is imagination itself. He will talk about the divine imagination, and again, I don't think he's just using the word divine there to add a bit of gloss or charge to the word. He's saying quite literally that the divine presence, we experience it directly in our imaginations. And the point about the imagination is it's not an optional extra. It's always already shaping our perception of things. We are thoroughly imaginative creatures. And even a very narrowed, focused kind of imagination, such as he felt was becoming more and more powerful in the modern world, these 200 years since he died, and producing the extraordinary presentation of the world, really, that we call science, that gives us the power of technology. That's still a full working of the imagination, but it's just single vision, as Blake put it, rather than fourfold vision. It's that great power that we're always already immersed in, the imagination, focused and focused and focused to do tremendous things, but at the great risk of losing touch with other things that the imagination can bring to us when we collaborate with it. And so I think this is what he felt we human beings have, is a kind of reflective consciousness, a freedom, therefore, that comes with that, to know that we're participating in this great flow of the imagination, that the imagination has us, not just we it. And what that enables human beings to do is to work with the imagination in a way that, say, the tree that is still part of that imaginative wisdom of living, manifesting in the form of the tree, we can collaborate with it in order that the imagination might be taken in new directions, different directions. I mean, an obvious example of that, I think, is the way that we use language. I'm inclined to feel that we're the only animals that use a full language in the sense of, grammar and syntax, and the ability that we have to talk on a screen like this. And if we can get the right words, take ourselves and our listeners in our shared imagination to different worlds to consider thoughts that aren't physically present to us. Whereas I think other animals that definitely use locutions definitely communicate, but it always seems to be very place specific, for example, or it's about what's going on in the moment. We can do that too, but we can also use language and poetry, language more broadly as well in imagery. Think of when you go to the cinema and it even takes you to another planet. This is the full richness of the language that human beings have. And I think Blake would say that that is a manifestation of what, by collaborating with the imagination, we're able to develop and to do. Language is an extraordinary thing when you think about it. And it's, though, another manifestation of the extraordinary thing that the imagination is doing around us otherwise. The reason why he says Jesus, the imagination, is that Jesus in Christian theology is the Logos. And the Logos is the Greek word for word, but it means the kind of creative, manifesting, desiring word that fills life. And so actually Logos and imagination are much closer together than sometimes is thought. And similarly, nature is imagination itself, because nature's diversity, richness, beauty, also, the sort of destructive sides of nature as well. This is all a kind of manifestation of the imagination that runs through it. Imagination is like, he wants to maximize the notion. There's almost, you can't say too much of the imagination, he would say. It requires discernment too. I mean, this is another part of it. He's absolutely clear that reason is necessary, but it's necessary to discern the imagination, to tease it, to form it, to deepen it, to distinguish between what Blake's near contemporary Coleridge would have called fancy rather than imagination. And imagination for Coleridge is a sharing in the infinite I am, another word for God. So Blake, I think, wants to restore this full imagination to us, and I do too. I try to, again, how far can we follow Blake with that notion of the imagination, and where does it take us, and how do we discern it, and what does it mean? The power of the imagination, is not just the turn of phrase. It really is trying to take that dunamis power, the power that can draw us, the allure, speaking to our desire. Why does what's good, beautiful, and true keep returning to us and promising to guide us? That's the power of the imagination.
Wonderful, Mark. Absolutely stunning, fascinating set of observations there and analyses. I want to ask you a different sort of question, which is about partly biographical about you, but I think also partly about Blake and how to locate him, I suppose. So let me give you both halves of the question, because I think they're a little bit connected. I know you well. I've read your books. I love them all. And latterly, you've written about Dante. You've written about the history of Christianity. I know you've written a lot about Plato in the past. And I suppose I was wondering where in your own intellectual journey, or why, I suppose, in your own intellectual journey, Blake was the next step. Like, to what degree he, in terms of your own process, I suppose, represented an evolution from Dante, if that's the word, or a way of thinking about language after Barfield, your work on Barfield and so on. So just where he fits in your personal kind of intellectual canon, I suppose, but also a parallel process which may overlap. I often think Blake gets treated as sort of sui generis figure, like one of a kind, as though he's just sort of arrived from Mars or something. But of course, he's very preoccupied with Milton, for example, and a little bit with Shakespeare, and he's not entirely on his own. Some people align him with the mystical tradition, English mystics and so on, and I know you've written and thought a lot about those. So it's a sort of similar question, but about how we locate Blake, first in your own sort of intellectual journey, and then maybe a bit more broadly, how do we fit him? Do we fit him in a tradition as a poet, as a mystic, as an artist, or just a kind of maverick?
Yeah, thanks again. Wonderful question. And I mean, in terms of my own turning to Blake, it's partly he was a bit like Dante for me. I regard myself as a Christian, a sort of porous, open kind of Christian, very drawn to other traditions too, but particularly on the mystical side, this interiority, that's what really matters to me. The social side is good, but it doesn't really find my passion. Certainly the sort of doctrinal or dogmatic, the kind of intellectual belief side, that doesn't worry me either. But what does is how can these traditions deepen life for us and speak to us in the tragedies and the difficulties, the suffering of life, and enable us to be more connected again to a wider world. And Christianity, if you like, is my first language. So both Dante and Blake are great figures in the Christian mystical tradition. And yet, for quite a large part of my life, turning to Dante and trying to read him, or turning to Blake and trying to read him, left me feeling almost despairing, really. What do these figures have that they're so celebrated and yet often so difficult? And first of all, with Dante and then now with Blake, very much my goal is to write in such a way that readers can feel they befriend Dante, they befriend Blake, and that then they become friends for life. Because this is really what happened to me. I had my own teachers that opened Dante and Blake up for me. And because of this richness of their vision, they're not just presenting, good moral values. They're not just presenting clearly articulated truths. They're presenting a dynamic lived life, which their poetry and their imagery, I mean, Dante's a very visual kind of poet as well, can be transformative. And so they're, in a way, both Dante and Blake are, I feel like it's a sort of spiral with me wanting to discover again and know in my own person, if you like, the richness of this tradition that comes to me in the first place through Christianity, but I think is in other traditions as well. I feel we kind of need it in our times. The despair, the sense of difficulty that is commonplace now in our times, I think ultimately is a kind of spiritual crisis. We've forgotten who we are and the communion that we're drawn to. The mystery that's in the world around us is in us as well. And I think Dante and Blake can make that mystery not just a bemusement, but an invitation to know more and more richly who we are and therefore who the world around us is. Yeah, so, I mean, in terms of Blake himself, I mean, I think he clearly does come from somewhere. He is a Georgian figure. I mean, in terms of his imagery, for example, it's no coincidence that he lives in this golden age of Gilray and others, with caricature and satire and so on. And you see that in Blake's work. And similarly, I think that his poetry too, the sort of free form of his poetry gets picked up by figures like Wordsworth and Coleridge as well. So he's in the same time as this great flourishing of lyrical ballads and hymns, and so he's clearly drawing on his time. But like really great figures that become universal and seem sui generis, it's only because they've developed their voice to that particular extent that you get this paradoxical thing that it seems to be speaking across time and place. It's like the novel where the more particular and individualized the characters are, the more the universal the story becomes. And I think that Blake's distinctiveness is very much like that. And you can think of other figures. I mean, Dante is similar. He's so particular that he really makes modern Italian. He does something that's quite extraordinary. But that that particularity is why we constantly go back and read again, and they feel like they return inspiration for the imaginative encounter with them.
Lovely. Well, I'm thinking maybe as the kind of final phase of our conversation here, Mark, an invitation to you to share a bit of Blake with us. I'm not asking you to flip open a book and read extracts, but maybe pick a line or two, an image or two, an engraving or two that particularly spoke to you. When obviously, in the book you quote several, and there are very famous lines in Blake, like you mentioned, the heaven in a grain of sand and so on. But there may be others. But it might be that our audience would appreciate you just taking us into a bit finer detail around a particular phrase or image that speaks to you, or maybe as a kind of, you see at least as a sort of portal a bit into some of Blake's world and thinking.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, the image that comes to mind is one of the images that Blake painted for his great patron, who we kind of owe this massive debt to because he kept buying Blake's work when few other people would, but Thomas Butts. Blake did a whole series, actually, of images of biblical stories for Butts. And they're fascinating because Blake always gives a twist to the biblical story and interprets a dimension to the biblical story, therefore, which incidentally I don't think means that he was some kind of idiosyncratic, even heretical Christian. What he's doing is reading the Bible in the way that it always was read, actually, before the Reformation, which is as an inspired text, that therefore is going to be dynamic, is going to speak to you in multifaceted ways. And so hermeneutics, before the Reformation did very much the same thing, and Blake's picking up on that. But the particular story and image that I find speaking to me time and time again is an image he painted of the story of the woman caught in adultery, who's brought before Jesus by her accusers. And the famous line from the story is, the person without sin should cast the first stone. So Jesus leans down in the sand. The judgment, according to the law, would be that she would be stoned. And it's a kind of trick, is Jesus going to show himself disloyal to the great tradition that he claims to be speaking from and speaking into? He pauses, writes in the sand. We don't know what he writes, but then comes up with this line, the person without sin should cast the first stone, and the accusers drift away. They realize that their bluff has been called. But Blake paints the moment after the accusers have left, when Jesus is before the woman. And of course, the brilliant thing about that moment is that in the gospel understanding, Jesus is the person without sin. So he could cast the first stone. She is held in this kind of moment of suspense, quite literally between life and death, and what's going to happen next. And that contrary, as Blake puts it, of which life and death is a particularly dramatic example, but between love and hate, which she's also held between. Is she going to be loved by this figure or hated by him, as her accusers had? And that is what it is to be alive, Blake said. We're constantly held within these contraries. And so this is a moment which focuses us on the reality of life as well. And what happens is that Jesus stands up, looks at her and says, go and sin no more. So in a way, he does judge her, but he judges her to liberate her rather than to condemn her. And I think this is, what Christianity and other traditions can do, is they can enable you to see life clearly, almost unbearably clearly at times, but honestly, and therefore to be able to embrace the moment. But then they also empower you to be liberated in that moment rather than condemned. And so Jesus is sort of bowing down before her and recognizing in her the divinity that also he knew to be in himself. And that is the biggest realization that by turning into life you can discover for we human beings, I think. This sense that in Christ, in the Christian tradition, is seen what's true in all of us. That if we enter the minute particulars of life, it can be frightening, it can be disturbing, but it can also be one of hope and possibility. And if we can bear that tension, then we'll be released into a fuller life. And I think Blake captures that in this wonderful image of him, Christ, before the woman caught in adultery, which you can find in the book and elsewhere, of course. But that takes me to a phrase as well, which I really like, which I can remember, I hope, which is this, where Blake, from his poem Milton, he writes this. He says, "There is a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment, and the industrious find this moment, and it amplify. For when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day, if rightly placed." I don't think it's amplify, actually. I think it's another word. But nonetheless, the point is that Blake is one of these figures who want to help us pay attention to what's going on right now in this moment and enter the multi-dimensional facets of that. Satan and Satan's watch fiends can't do it because Satan, has this kind of single vision. It's the possessiveness, it's the fear that rules the satanic view. And so it narrows and it becomes opaque to the richness of things, Blake says. But the industrious find this moment, those who are really engaged with life. And then when that moment that might come to us in a glimpse is rightly placed, it renovates every moment of the day. So it can become a path that we follow. And I think this is a key to understanding Blake's work, actually, the poetry, particularly the later poetry, because what Blake finds is the way to take a moment, but look at it one way, look at it another, see the depth, see the manifest presences in any particular moment, which is why in his poetry he can move even in a sentence between what's happening for one character to what's happening to a mountain that's nearby, to what's happening to a country or nation that's also in that moment too. He moves across these different dimensions of our experience. You and I work in different ways with inner life, and the techniques that we learn therapeutically, that's really what they're about, is unpacking the many facets of any particular moment. And I think this is what Blake's poetry enables us to do as well. And so it's why, when you suddenly, it's something sort of clicks often with Blake's poetry, and what had seemed sort of obscure and almost like a wall of words coming at you, you start to think, oh my goodness, he is resonating with this moment in every day, that now I can begin to find and maybe become one of the industrious ones that might know it renovating, every moment of my day. And then, we try and share that and transmit that and cultivate it in our lives more broadly too.
Mark, absolutely brilliant. I love the energy and the eloquence and something else beginning with the erudition that you've brought to this discussion as well as the book. And let me just encourage people watching this, if you haven't already bought your copy of Awake, do buy it. It's the best book on Blake out there. And I should know, I've read a few. And Mark, you are presumably available to come and talk at various gigs and what have you, if people should be so inclined, or they can follow up with you on your website, I suppose, can they?
Or yeah, no, for sure. So markvernon.com. Thanks very much indeed. Yeah, no, I feel on a journey with this as well, and a mission too. So actually, Blake keeps opening up to me, and speaking like this is one of the ways that happens. I think because we're trying to use this language and it's speaking to us, even in the searching and the questing. Look, thanks very much. And maybe I just wanted to mention one other thing as well, Robert, which is, since we're speaking and since people are listening, that we ourselves have a kind of endeavour to use language in this expansive way with our philosophy slam, which is when the two of us get together in front of a live audience and the audience calls out words and we riff on the words and see where it takes us. We use insights from psychology and philosophy and spirituality and literature, past and present. And our new endeavour is to take this to the internet as well. And so very soon, watch this space, we'll be launching Philosophy Slam, the podcast, where we take two words and they may be produced by a random generator. They may be two words that came together from our last Slam Live. And for 20 minutes or so, we see where that might take us and lead us, and what unpacks about reality, the resonances, the harmonies, the disharmonies. And Robert, I mean, it's always a tremendous thing to do. It's really a joy. So I look forward to Philosophy Slam, the podcast, as well, and we'll be posting some of those very soon.
Very good. Very well said, Mark. Yeah, no, it's a fantastic thing, the Philosophy Slam. So we'll draw it to a close there, shall we? Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for listening. Thank you, Mark. Well done on the book. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Robert, as well. A joy, as ever, to talk to you about these things.